Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear ambassadors, distinguished guests, good morning to our participants from North America. Good evening to our participants from Eastern Europe and the Russian Federation. I wish to welcome you all to our online
meeting
event
is being recorded
on the timely topic, New Start. Let me express a warm thank you to our speakers, Rose Gottemöller, Alexei Abartov, and Susanne Baumann, who are going to present the experiences and insights into the new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty. This is a joint event together with Atomic Reporters in a series of events on current developments in arms control instruments. In a rapidly changing world, where challenges are increasingly jeopardizing our security structure, it is of utmost importance to look into the world of diplomacy and negotiations, into history as well as into the future. What has been achieved? What would we like to achieve in the near future on arms control? Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Tariq Rauf, who will be moderating today's event. Tariq is board member of Atomic Reporters and former head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia. I too would like to join Claudia in welcoming everyone to this very interesting webinar. This session will be recorded and made available on Facebook and the website of the Multilateral Dialogue of the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation, and also on the website of Atomic Reporters. The opinions expressed are those of the speakers. This online discussion will be moderated, and we request participants to put up their questions in the Q&A box on screen. We have three of the most qualified and experienced speakers on matters concerning nuclear arms reductions and arms control between the Russian Federation and the United States, two countries that between them hold more than 90% of the approximately 13,500 nuclear weapons in the world. Over the past 5 decades or so, the two countries have reduced their nuclear weapon holdings by about 80 to 85% over their Cold War heights, and have concluded and implemented a number of bilateral nuclear arms control agreements. However, the only one surviving is New START. The last agreement to fall away was the Treaty on Shorter and Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces that eliminated these systems globally. Our first speaker will be Rose Gottemöller. She was Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security during the Obama presidency. Rose was the chief US negotiator of New START, and then she went on to become Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Currently, she is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and also is associated with Stanford University's Freeman Spokely Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Rose has just published her book entitled Negotiating the New START Treaty. In this book, she recounts her experience of these negotiations. In her epilogue, she recalls that the long break in US-Russia direct nuclear arms control negotiations ended up being detrimental, and she suggests that much detailed work will have to be done by experts, and the two countries must continue to make progress in controlling and limiting nuclear weapons, which Rose rightly says is our responsibility to humanity. Next, we will have Alexei Abartov, who is a former deputy chairman of the Defense Committee of the State Duma and was a member of the Russian delegation for START 1. Currently, he's the director for the Center of International Security at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, MMO, in Moscow. He recently published with the Russian and the American Academies of Sciences a paper entitled Nuclear Perils in a New Nuclear Era, bringing perspective to the nuclear choices facing Russia and the United States. He also illuminates the gravity of the current situation facing policymakers in Washington and in Moscow about negotiating a follow-on to the next treaty, or the follow-on treaty to New START. He suggests that if New START was negotiated in 1 year, perhaps the follow-on treaty could also be negotiated in 1 year, and I'd be happy to hear Rose's comments on that later on. And Alexei also points out that we have had a 10-year gap in negotiations between Russia and the United States on nuclear arms control. Our third and final speaker will be Suzanne Baumann, the Federal Commissioner and head of the German Federal Foreign Office's Directorate General for International Order, the United Nations, and Arms Control. She has served in other senior positions in the German Foreign Office. In the NPT context, Germany is a member of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, and more recently of the Stockholm Initiative on stepping stones towards nuclear disarmament. In the Berlin-Stockholm ministerial statement, the Stockholm Initiative countries inter alia called on the US and Russia to extend New START, to engage in talks on possible expansion, and for other nuclear weapon states to reduce or further reduce their nuclear arsenals. I am truly privileged to moderate this session. I first met Rose when she was working with Energy Secretary Bill Richardson, and he would punt to her my questions on the burnup of plutonium released from dismantled US and Russian warheads for burnup in Canadian CANDU reactors. And I met Alexei in Moscow in the context of a joint Russian and American Academies of Sciences project in post-Soviet nuclear matters, and often since in the International Luxembourg Forum. And of course, met Suzanne Baumann several times in the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review process. So very briefly, the New START Treaty was extended by the two sides on the 3rd of February. It will now go on until February 2026. Fortunately, the Biden administration has reversed the previous administration's policy and has released the latest numbers that the two sides have under START. So currently, as of March 1, Russia had 517 deployed strategic delivery systems, 1,456 deployed strategic nuclear warheads, and 767 deployed and non-deployed strategic launches. As of the same date, the United States had 651 deployed strategic delivery systems, 1,357 deployed strategic nuclear warheads, and 800 deployed and non-deployed strategic launches. As people would recall, last Wednesday, Presidents Putin and Biden met in Geneva and agreed on a presidential joint statement on strategic stability, in which they inter alia committed to nuclear arms control, reaffirmed the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, and agreed to set up an integrated bilateral strategic stability dialogue. So with this introduction, may I now invite Rose Gottmuller to inform us of her views. Rose?
Thank you very much, Tariq. I have to say that question to Bill Richardson, which got tossed to me, is you talked about burning up plutonium. It's burned into my memory because it was impossibly technical and I wasn't prepared for it. So I will always remember the name of Tariq Raouf from that experience. But it was a good question to ask, definitely. I still don't know the answer, by the way. But yes, interesting you began with the numbers from the latest data exchange for the New START Treaty. I thought it would be useful for your listeners just to understand that the numbers are currently below in both the United States and Russian Federation what is permitted under New START. The New START Treaty permits 1,550 operationally deployed warheads and 700 delivery vehicles on each side. So the United States and Russian Federation numbers for both warheads and delivery vehicles are below the New START numbers at the current time. But of course, both sides have the opportunity to come back up to those numbers during the lifetime of the New START Treaty. This is not to imply they should necessarily stay below them, but I think it does, to me, indicate that there is some room for further reductions. And I will look forward to seeing what the review of the Biden administration produces, their nuclear posture review, and their readiness to proceed with further reductions. I'll be interested if Alexei has any comments on this, whether the Russian Federation is looking at further reductions now and to what levels. But I do think the next strategic arms reduction treaty should in fact be a strategic arms reduction treaty and include further reductions. By the way, and the reason I bring this up is this was not the position of the Trump administration. They did not want to see further reductions in the next treaty. So that is why it's a matter for review and consideration in the US government, but I'm pretty confident that there will be a proposal for further reductions coming out of the current team. Now, in terms of New START, if you've had a chance to read my book already, and thank you, Tariq, for giving it a brief advertisement, but you will realize as I write that it was supposed to be one of a series of treaties. If you will remember, President Obama was quite keen at the time of his Prague speech in April of 2009 to put in place during his time in office, he hoped 8 years, 2 or 3 treaties. And so really, New START was supposed to be a stopgap. START was going out of force in December of 2009, and we needed to act quickly to ensure there was a replacement treaty in place. Both the Russian Federation and the United States was resolved in this matter. President Obama and then President Medvedev issued those firm instructions that we needed to act quickly to try to get the treaty finished between April and December of 2009, which was unprecedented speed. But we were able, in fact, to, I think, achieve almost that deadline by getting the treaty finished by April of 2010. So it took a little bit longer than required. But in fact, it ended up being the only treaty that President Obama was able to accomplish. I think it's a very good treaty. It is solid both in the reductions that it put in place for the two sides, but it is also very solid in its verification and monitoring regime, which has now stood the test of time. The treaty's been in implementation for 10 years now, and the verification regime has stood the test of time. So despite the fact we did not get further reductions on top of New START during the Obama administration, I do think that New START has established a solid foundation now to proceed forward to the next stage of strategic arms reduction. Again, I realize that both President Biden and President Putin have indicated a readiness to continue now with new negotiations. They spoke about this in their telephone call in April. It was not so explicit in the joint statement that came out of the summit meeting last week, but they did pledge to launch a new dialogue on strategic stability, so-called SSD in English, Strategic Stability Dialogue. They pledged to launch it as soon as possible and to get moving with considering all the issues, both that affect the strategic balance, the strategic stability balance, and that would be required to put in place the framework for new nuclear reduction negotiations. So I do understand that the tasking will be in 2 parts, to the US and the Russian governments to consider what should be on the agenda for a wide-ranging strategic stability dialogue and what should be on the agenda to put in place a framework for a new strategic arms reduction treaty that then would also require development. Obviously, a framework is a good thing. It's a kind of structure for negotiations, but then, of course, must be filled in with many further details and a lot of serious substantive work. I have been urging our 2 governments to get moving quickly because we did manage to do a lot in the 1-year negotiation of New START, but actually it was very much a traditional treaty. We were not trying to break any new ground, really, although I do argue that our approach to monitoring and verifying warheads was an important change from the past. In the past, we always used a counting rule approach, whereby if a missile was tested with 10 warheads, it was always counted with 10 warheads. If the maximum number observed during flight testing was 10 warheads, then it was always counted with 10 warheads. Well, the US Navy began to complain about this because they decided with their Trident submarine missiles that they would begin to download those missiles to take the numbers below the 8 maximum that the counting rule required. And they said, well, we are paying a penalty in START because we don't have nearly so many strategic submarine warheads as are counted in the treaty. So please try to attain more accuracy in warhead counting in the New START treaty. And I think we were able to achieve that with our approach to reentry vehicle on-site inspection, in which inspectors confirm the declared number of warheads on each missile through a process of observation. The missiles, the lids of the missiles are removed. The reentry vehicles are then placed under a cover, but the cover is malleable so that the inspectors can observe and actually count the number of warheads displayed. And if there are extra objects, then they are allowed to use a radiation detection system to confirm that these are non-nuclear objects. non-nuclear objects could be things like decoys, for example, for a missile defense system. So I do think that we broke some new ground in the New START treaty. I actually think that new ground will be beneficial as we proceed to the next much more challenging phase, which will be to try to accomplish direct limits on warheads. And as the United States is arguing on all nuclear warheads, both deployed and non-deployed, strategic and non-strategic warheads. And I think a beneficial precedent was set for this by President Trump, actually, when he proposed to President Putin, and President Putin agreed that there should be a freeze on all warheads. Now, a freeze, of course, is not a negotiated limit. A freeze is a unilateral parallel gesture as a confidence building measure. But I thought that that was an important first step, that this precedent had been set, that the United States and Russia should put limits directly on warheads. So now we have some work to do. I know that this is a goal of the Biden administration to establish limits on warheads, whether a limit on all warheads or not, again, subject to review. It might be couched somewhat differently, but I do believe that that is the priority. I think the Russian Federation has different priorities for the negotiations. I will let Alexei speak to that. I'm sure he will have some comments. The other thing that the United States is very interested in getting more of a handle on in the next negotiations are the so-called exotic delivery vehicles that the Russian Federation has rolled out over the last few years. They were announced by President Putin in his famous remarks of March 2018, and there's a lot of interest in seeing how we might get constraints on these exotic new systems, some of which they're not so exotic, but they are already falling under the limits of New START. That is the Sarmat, so-called Sarmat heavy ICBM will already fall under the constraints of New START. And the Russians have announced that their hypersonic glide vehicle, the Avangard HGV system, will also fall under the limits of New START. So we are really talking about what I consider the really exotic systems, those that are nuclear propelled, for example. And there's also then an air-launched ballistic missile, the Kinjal, that will have to be dealt with. So these are, I would say, the priorities of the U.S. side in advancing the next stage of negotiations. Again, I think the Russian side will have different priorities, and so we'll have to bring the two sides together. That's what a negotiation is all about. But I am hopeful that the experience of negotiating and implementing New START, with its positive aspects, but also some negative aspects, nevertheless, it has been good experience, and I hope it will serve us well in this next phase of negotiation. So with that, Tariq, I think I've filled up my 10 minutes of time, and I will pass the floor back to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rose. That was a very good introduction. I just wanted to show people Rose's book, although it's sort of appearing in reverse. I also wanted to show Alexei's paper with the Academies of Sciences. And with that, Alexei, may I now invite you for your comments, please?
Thank you. Since we are in a book selling festival, I will show my new book, which was recently published. It's called Strategic Stability, Arms and Diplomacy, but it's in Russian. Maybe it will be translated into English sometime. Let me start with your question, Tariq. In that article in the booklet that you showed, which was written by me and Steve Miller, and forwarded by the two presidents of the Academies of Sciences, including the president of Russian Academy of Science, academician Sergeyev, it was written 2 or 3 years ago, and then updated because the process of doing a joint booklet took a very long time. When I said that the New START was negotiated in 1 year, and we should negotiate in as short a time the next START, it was before the expiration of the extension time. And 2 years prior to its expiration, a lot of experts and politicians started to talk about, let us extend the New START, even before it expired, 2 years before it was expired. I thought that agreeing on that would immediately make bureaucracies relax and do nothing until the expiration time ends. And that is why I tried to urge both Russian and American government not to wait till expiration and then think about extension, but rather to start negotiating on the follow-on treaty. And that is why at that time I said that New START was negotiated in 1 year. We could, if we do a good job, we could have the next New START or follow-on to New START in just as short a time with proper attention and effort applied. That is the explanation. The history was different, as you know. We barely had time to extend the New START before its expiration last February. And now we have 5 years to negotiate the next treaty. The whole process of START negotiations is already half a century old. Not many people realize that. It started half a century ago. During that time, we concluded 10 major treaties and agreements. Some of those were ratified, others were not ratified, but they affected greatly the arms race and strategic arsenals of the two nuclear superpowers. In particular, according to the present figures on strategic warheads, we reduced our strategic warhead numbers in summarily in sum, from about 20,000 to less than 3,000 during that time of negotiation. That is an important achievement. What is not an important achievement is that during the last 10 years, we didn't have any negotiations. That is another unique feature of the present situation. Never before, during the 50 years history of strategic negotiations, did we have such a long pause, such a long break in negotiations. Even at worst times, when the Soviet army entered Afghanistan and SALT II treaty was not ratified, we started negotiations on the next treaty within 2 years after that. That is the significance, what is significant about it. The priority that was dedicated by leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States to that channel of reducing strategic arms and preventing nuclear war. Since we had recently a long pause, we have diverged very far away from each other in our understanding of strategic stability. So strategic stability is not something good, something nice. It's a very particular strategic definition, strategic concept that was agreed between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1990 in the course of negotiating START I treaty. And that provided several technical criteria for strategic stability and provide definition of strategic stability as a state of strategic relationship which removes incentives for the first nuclear strike. That is very important. Now we have diverged, as I said, and we have very different views of strategic stability because of that long break in negotiations. That is why, for the first time in half-century history of strategic arms control, we are now to start consultations and then negotiations, disagreeing even on the subject of our talks. That happened when we first started negotiations in 1969. Then we agreed on the subject and moved forward with those 10 treaties and agreements that I mentioned. Now, for the first time in that long period, we do not have agreement on the subject. To put it in a very concise manner, the difference is that the Russian side wants to limit strategic arms, both nuclear and non-nuclear, that is conventional. The United States wants to limit nuclear arms, both strategic and non-strategic. This is a very serious difference, very serious difference. And it will take a lot of time to come to some agreement on this subject. Also, for the first time in that long history, our main problem is not with the central element of strategic balance. which is strategic triads of both sides: land and sea-based ballistic missiles and heavy bombers and their warheads. This issue now is the easiest one, but the major problem is the adjacent issues, which will be presented by the two states at the beginning of consultations and probably negotiations. Those, by the order of priorities of those issues, priorities in the sense of creating difficulties for the process of negotiations, I will list them like follows. American proposal to limit not only deployed but non-deployed nuclear warheads as well, including tactical and strategic non-deployed nuclear warheads. Next one, Russian proposal to limit both nuclear and conventional strategic arms, that is long-range, precision-guided, non-nuclear missiles, which can perform strategic tasks. Third, ballistic missile defenses, because Russian position is that not only offensive, but also defensive strategic arms are to be addressed by the next agreement. That would be third as a difficult for the negotiations. The fourth would be medium-range missiles. It's quite possible that medium-range missiles will be a subject of negotiations. And you know the fate of the INF Treaty and all the disagreements which exist now on that subject. Certainly that would be a difficult issue to resolve, and it will involve third nuclear weapon states, in particular China. That's American position that China should be involved in limiting medium-range missiles, and that would expand the format of negotiations if that is subject is pursued. And finally, space and cyber. Those are very esoteric, exotic subjects. Space less so, cyber more so, and they would certainly be discussed. Responding to Rose's question about whether Russian government would like to further reduce strategic arms, I think that yes, Russian government certainly is looking forward to doing that, and in fact, it would be very easy to do that. One possible trick to reduce strategic arms would be to count bomber weapons, bomber nuclear weapons. Those are long-range, air-launched nuclear cruise missiles. If you add those to counting rules, you already have a reduction by 200 warheads, because presently they are counted as one single warhead, regardless of how many may be deployed on a bomber, up to 20, as we know by START 1 counting rules, they are counted as one. This is a very serious discount. If you add nuclear gravity bombs, which are a serious nuclear weapon, after all, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by nuclear gravity bombs, you have another 100 or more. If you add conventional air-launched cruise missiles on heavy bombers, you have another reduction by a few hundred of warheads. So even with the present ceilings of 1,550 deployed warheads, if you add those which are actually strategic but not counted as strategic, you have reduction down to about 1,000 warheads. And by the way, as Rose knows better than anybody else, the New START doesn't say nuclear warheads. 1,550 is the ceiling for warheads. It doesn't say nuclear, it's just for warheads. All those issues that I mentioned certainly would be subject for negotiations. And finalizing my remarks, I would say that fortunately in Geneva, the agreement was reached to start strategic stability dialogue. Before starting negotiations, in the course of consultations, the two sides at least have to agree on the list of subjects to be negotiated, because otherwise negotiations would not start. But there is another danger to it, that the dialogue on strategic stability would turn into a scholastic theoretical discussion which will go on and on without starting actual negotiations. That happened during the last several years at strategic stability dialogue between Russia and the United States and between the United States and China. No result, zero. So we should not repeat that experience, and we should repeat the experience of the time when the serious strategic arms reduction started. That was with START 1 treaty, exactly in the course of negotiations of START 1 treaty. The strategic stability was discussed in a separate group, and I was lucky to participate in that group, among others, being at negotiations. And only in application to particular arms limitations, strategic stability, formula and understanding can be worked out and prove effective and conducive to achieving agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexei, for giving us the Russian position. And may I now invite Suzanne Baumann for her comments, please?
Yes, I will do so. And a very good evening to everyone. But first, let me thank the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation and you, Tariq, and the Atomic Reporters for organizing this panel tonight. I think it comes at a very good point of time. I would like to add the perspective of a non-nuclear weapon state to the whole discussion, but a non-nuclear weapon state which is very much engaged in disarmament, one of our foreign and security policy priorities. My Foreign Minister Maas, has called 2021 a watershed year for arms control. And I think there are several very good reasons for that. Let me say a couple of words on the NPT, which is not the subject of today's discussion, but I think which is central for disarmament, for arms control. NPT being the central pillar of the ADN architecture, is at a critical juncture right now. We remain committed to secure the future success of the treaty at the upcoming review conference, because I think here we can all agree that we need urgent and tangible progress in nuclear disarmament and arms control. For a successful NPT, but first and foremost for the transatlantic and global security and stability. So I'm very glad that we have seen two very important signals in the field of disarmament and arms control in this year. First, of course, we were very pleased about the extension of the New START treaty in February on day one of the Biden administration. I think this can not be underestimated. The New START extension for us marks only the beginning of a new process. It provides, and this has been mentioned, a good basis for negotiating broader US-Russian future arms control arrangements. Therefore, and secondly, we highly welcome the summit between President Biden and President Putin just a week ago. As Foreign Minister Maas has stated this morning after a meeting with Secretary Blinken, we are extremely grateful to President Biden that he has taken this important initiative to meet, despite all the well-known political tensions in the bilateral relationship between Russia and US. And of course, once again, the German perspective, we stand ready to support the agreed strategic stability talks on arms control wherever this is possible and wherever this is useful for both sides. But as we are also concerned with regard to our security interests, as I've said, we stand ready. We consider, looking back to the Biden summit, Biden-Putin summit, we consider it as a very positive step that both sides recommitted to the Reagan-Gorbachev principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. I think when you look to doctrines and what can be next steps, that was a very clear and a very important message. Rose, Alexei, you both have mentioned it. The resumption of the strategic stability talks could lay, of course, the foundation for potential further agreements on arms control and disarmament. And what I deem especially important, also additional nuclear risk reduction measures. But I think no one is under illusion, and the two of you have very clearly explained where the US, where Russia is standing. We will have extremely difficult and complex negotiations ahead of us. Alexei, if I understand you right, if we do reach this state of negotiations, and I think it's very important to see where a common ground can be identified. So now from a German perspective, what are our expectations on future arrangements? Rose, you have mentioned it, for further reduction in strategic nuclear arsenals. Already back in 2013, then President Obama, and you have mentioned that, has proposed an additional reduction of 1/3 with regard to nuclear strategic weapons. We are convinced that this could be further explored because we do not see any negative consequences on strategic stability if this step would be taken. That was point one. Point two, we have to broaden the scope of the New START treaty. In our view, it's very necessary that a new arrangement would capture all Russian nuclear systems, including the highly destabilizing doomsday systems, and you have mentioned those such as Poseidon or the Burevestnik. But we are particularly concerned about the massive qualitative and quantitative disparity in non-strategic nuclear arsenals in favor of Russia, and especially those weapon systems pose a threat to European security. So it is crucial for us that, one, we capture all of Russian weapon systems, but particularly also have a focus on the sub-strategic ones. A third point from a German perspective is that new or future arrangements have to adapt to new technologies and new security domains. Just to mention a few: artificial intelligence in weapon systems, hypersonics, lethal autonomous weapon systems, space, or cyber. I think we can all agree that these new technologies come with a fundamental change of warfare, with an impact on deterrence and defense. And of course, we see a new complexity and ambiguity coming along with a high risk of miscalculation and also unwanted escalation. Therefore, we have to look into new approaches, how to cover these new technologies, because the arms control instruments we have at hand right now are definitively not there to deal with these new technologies or with new security domains. So, of course, we have for the time being very interesting debates on approaches based on regulation of responsible behavior, distinct from the object-based approaches like counting tanks and aircrafts and missiles. I think we have to further develop this approach and somehow find a way to include it into the bilateral talks between Russia and the US. But here we need also a more global approach. So I think from a German perspective, these are the most important points. As I've said, it will not be easy. looking at the different positions and the various priorities. But I think we should build up on these positive signals, the extension of the New START Treaty, the Biden-Putin summit, and then I think I see a good chance to advance in arms control, nuclear disarmament. And from a European security point of view, this would be more than necessary. So we encourage both sides to move forward. Thank you, Tariq.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for rounding up the picture from a non-nuclear weapon state's point of view. I think at this point, maybe I'll ask each of you if you would like to comment on what the others have said, briefly starting with Rose, then Alexei, and then Suzanne, and then we can pick up on the questions.
Hey, thank you very much. I noted, and Suzanne, that's a very good point about the 2013 Berlin proposal for an up to 1/3 further reduction in operationally deployed strategic warheads. As far as I understand, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States has never taken that off the table. So it stands. And so this is, again, as far as I understand, I actually haven't, talked to anyone, but I do believe that it is still potentially something that could be broached in the, renewing that offer could be broached in the next round of negotiations. But I also understand that it will be part of the U.S. nuclear posture review, and so they are unlikely to say they are renewing that offer, the Biden administration, until they've had a chance to carefully review the matter with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the military actors. Alexei, you and I've had this conversation before. I guess I'm a little more optimistic than you are, particularly because some of the precedents set in New START, not only on reentry vehicle on-site inspection, but also on the permit and count approach to conventionally armed strategic range systems, so-called in those days during the negotiations, prompt global strike systems. And essentially what it implies is that the United States is never going to deploy a lot of them. So in New START, prompt global strike, long-range conventional systems were permitted, but they had to be counted as nuclear warheads. They had to be counted as a nuclear system. I can see that, and one of the points I wanted to stress in thinking about the future negotiations is that we will have to take a phased approach, as always, and see what we can accomplish. And so perhaps we just carry forward that precedent and take a permit and count approach to long-range conventional systems. Now, I know the Russian Federation is concerned about more than that. It's concerned about intermediate range, conventional, highly accurate systems, et cetera, but I wouldn't be surprised if the US administration, at least in a first phase, would be willing to extend the precedent of New START to the next negotiation and to the next agreement of a permit and count approach. But we shall see. Again, this is just my speculation, but it gives me reason to be slightly more optimistic that we can come to some meeting of minds on what the substance of the next negotiations should be. Likewise, I think the step-by-step or phased approach plays to the benefit of the Russian side too, in your concern about not moving immediately to limit all warheads. And that gets to the proposal that you have put on the table. And as I understand from Minister Ryabkov yesterday in his remarks to the Carnegie Endowment, is being reviewed or positively considered by the Russian side, and that is to initially place limits on all operationally deployed warheads rather than, again, and that gets at the point you made about tightening up the bomber counting rule and counting outcomes, counting air-launched cruise missiles, counting potentially gravity bombs as well, if they are considered operationally deployed. In the US case, there's some definitional issues that will have to be worked through because we do not actually load nuclear warheads on bombers on a day in, day out basis. So and neither does NATO for that matter. So there are some issues to be worked through there, but nevertheless, I found that a very interesting comment from Minister Ryabkov that we should focus on all deployed strategic warheads as the next phase, and then think about in future what more can be done on non-deployed systems. Again, whether the USG will take that up or not, but I think it's an idea well worth considering, as long as it is not the end of the story, but would be considered part of a step-by-step approach. So maybe I'll stop there. Tarek, over to you.
Thank you. Alexei?
Well, I'm very happy to hear what Rose says. I didn't hear what Sergei Rybkov say yesterday at the Carnegie conference, but to my mind, there is certain logic in strategic arms control. Those who study 50 years of experience would know that there is certain logic. For example, if we are proposing to limit long-range precision-guided conventional systems that are basically strategic in the targets that they can hit, in the functions they can perform. You cannot omit nuclear cruise missiles, which are designed for heavy bombers at least. And so there is certain logic in that, and starting with the limitation on all operational, providing definition of operational and dealing with those nuclear air-launched cruise missiles and gravity bombs, which are exactly deployed at bomber bases to be quickly loaded on bombers if given such authority. That would be a very logical first step. And besides, since those missiles and bombs are deployed in depots and storages, that will provide us with some experience in controlling weapons which are not deployed because they are in storages. Why is it so important? Dealing with tactical nuclear weapons means dealing with weapons in storage. No tactical nuclear weapons are deployed on their delivery systems in peacetime. They are in storages in depots of various types. And so to limit them, you have to go into storages and to count them and make sure that you agree on certain limitation and you can verify that limitation. So besides, in those storages, there are not only tactical nuclear arms, but there are those strategic nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear warheads, which Rose mentioned when she said about counting actual warheads. Both sides, the United States more, Russia less, reduced their strategic nuclear warheads by downloading their missiles and putting those warheads into storages. So they are non-deployed for the time being. And they are to be counted together with tactical nuclear warheads, which are all in storages at the basis of Navy and Air Force, and also in centralized storages, which are under centralized command. It is important because from the point of view of uploading very quick reconstitution, non-deployed strategic warheads are much more dangerous than non-deployed nuclear warheads. They can be quickly returned to their ballistic missiles and bombers and provide for 2 or 3 times growth in strategic nuclear force. With tactical nuclear weapons, it's different, but it's so certainly subject of expert discussion and negotiations. How do strategic warheads relate to strategic stability? My opinion, for instance, is that tactical nuclear warheads in centralized storages are not so much connected or related to strategic stability. But those warheads at forward bases, in depots and forward bases, they are related to strategic stability because they can be quickly involved in any conventional conflict, even the local one. So we have to work on this much more, and I hope we will do that.
Thank you, Alexei. Suzanne?
Yeah, I think I can be quite brief on this because listening to Rose and Alexei, we all see the complexity of the issue at hand, the broad range of issues which have to be taken into consideration, and of course the different positions of the US and the Russian side. So I see quite the danger, Alexei. You have mentioned that when you start strategic stability talks and try to find a comprehensive solution, you will never come to a phase where you really can talk to the real substance, where you really can come to arms control or disarmament. So, Rose, I think your step-by-step approach is absolutely the most efficient way ahead. One word on technical short-range nuclear weapons. I can only underline that from a German perspective, these kind of weapons are a threat to our security because they can be easily deployed. They are difficult to detect, and we had this discussion time and again, and I think I can only underline it's necessary that in a future arrangement these types of weapons will be covered. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have some comments, and Beatrice Hauer pointed out that Professor Andrei Pavlov of St. Petersburg State University has published a book called Nuclear Russia, which she is recommending to participants. Senator Doug Roach of Canada, who set up the Middle Powers Initiative, wants to know the views of the speakers on no first use. This is something that's apparently being discussed in the US as well, and there are some reports that President Biden favors it. I think there were some discussions even during the Obama administration. Others are critical of no first use, so I'd be interested in your views, and maybe we can go in reverse order, starting with Suzanne, Alexei, and then Rose.
I think the no first use question is in the first place a discussion which is ongoing in the US, and I'm sure that allies will be consulted on this question. In general terms, I think it's very clear, and this has been stated and restated in the NPT context, that a reduced role of nuclear weapons in doctrines is something the NPT community welcomes.
Thank you. Alexei?
I am wholeheartedly in favor of no first use, but with two conditions. One is that conventional balances in Europe, in the Far East, are such that there is no threat of conventional aggression. In fact, that was achieved 30 years ago by the Conventional Force Reduction Treaty in Europe. And that was a very important incentive to drastically reduce tactical nuclear weapons by both Russia and the United States. Unfortunately, United States and NATO did not adopt no first use concept at that time. And then Russia followed their example, and then 1993 returned to the first use doctrine, which was before that rejected in 1992 by Leonid Brezhnev. So no first use is difficult to verify, but as a strategic concept, it will acquire serious meaning, provided that conventional balance between the sides in Europe and in Asia are such that aggression is not possible. And secondly, that conventional strategic arms, which can deliver strikes against nuclear weapons and other targets, are limited as well.
Thank you. Rose?
Well, at the moment, I am rather cautious about no first use because it always arouses a good deal of questions among our allies. And this is a moment at which the Biden administration is trying to strengthen and re-strengthen ties with both our NATO allies and our allies in the Indo-Pacific. And so I am, not against no first use as a declaratory doctrine, but I haven't placed it in the first priority for this administration. I have emphasized that, in fact, they should be working to get the negotiations going as soon as possible. I like what Alexei said a few moments ago about how bureaucracies can really, I think the word in Russian, Alexei, is tarmazit. They can really slow things down. They can slow roll. They can prevent progress. And I think
I would say subvert, not just
But for me, the first order of business is to get the two sides to the negotiating table. And that is going to take some considerable work. I do remember the debates over no first use, not only in the Obama administration, but also in the Clinton administration. They took a lot of time. They burned up a lot of bureaucratic effort. And in the end of the day, in part because of concerns about extended deterrence among our allies, the United States drew back. And I think it's a good discussion to have. It's just at this moment, I would place the emphasis on getting back to the negotiating table and have our governments working on all the heavy lifting, the hard work that needs to be done to get the two sides back to the negotiating table as soon as possible.
Thank you. So we have a question from the former Iranian ambassador to the IAEA, Sultanieh, who's reflecting a view from the non-aligned movement. He wants to know how nuclear modernization could be captured in a follow-on agreement. And he also comments that nuclear arms control has legitimized nuclear weapons. And that's a view that some in the NAM and some non-nuclear weapon states also express. So I was wondering what your comments might be, maybe starting with Alexei.
I think that nuclear arms control did not legitimize nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were the fact of life, whether you legitimize them or not, whether you like them or not. Arms control provided an instrument of controlling those weapons, reducing those weapons, and that could be done by treaties. And by treaties, certainly, you make arms control limitation a norm of international law. That would be my explanation. Now, about the new systems. So the question was about new nuclear weapon, right?
Yes.
Well, I'm sure they will be dealt with in the next round of START negotiations in one or the other way. And I'm expressing only my personal opinion. For instance, the easiest thing would be to count all of them by their warhead number, and in this way to severely limit them, because those exotic and very expensive systems are not very cost effective compared to traditional ballistic missiles and heavy bombers. So if you put them into counting rules and you put them under ceilings, they will not be deployed in large numbers, because then you would have to reduce drastically those much more reliable and familiar systems that both Russia and the United States have. But also, I would not exclude the possibility of some kind of trade-off. For instance, some of those systems which Rose mentioned and which President Putin proposed in 2018, they were justified by the need to counter American ballistic missile defense, in particular space-based ballistic missile defense. If the United States agree to revive the ABM treaty provision banning deployment of ballistic missile defenses in space, then quite possibly, as in a way of trade-off, some of those exotic systems could be banned as well.
Thank you. Rose?
Yes, I wanted to also point to the freedom to mix notion in Russian strategic arms control, and how it actually does force choices on both Moscow and Washington. And so I really wanted to stress that point to the ambassador, that even though systems are being modernized, and in the case of the United States, I call our nuclear modernization a judicious modernization, because it is taking place under the limits of the New START treaty. And so there is no opportunity now that New START is extended for nuclear arms racing between the United States and Russia in the immediate period. If New START is not replaced, if we dispense with limits on nuclear weapon systems going forward, then yes, we could end up in another arms race. But the modernization is taking place under the 700 limit for delivery vehicles on New START in the New START treaty. So the United States, if it does build and deploy some kind of new system, I don't see that coming at the moment, but if it starts to build and deploy a new system, it would have to make choices about, as Alexei put it, which of its reliable older systems now replaced with modern systems, but in the same pedigree, in essence, a new generation of an existing system, then it would have to trade off reliability for some exotic new technology. And, is the United States going to decide to do that? I would have my doubts. New systems that were more exotic technologies, I think, would be limited in their deployments because of the limits of New START. So that's why I believe it is very important for the United States and Russia to continue in a regime of limitation over time so that we cannot fall into an arms race trap. I just think that's not good it's not good for global stability, but it's also not good for our national budgets. It's a waste of money to get into a nuclear arms race trap. So I also have a very pragmatic reason not to want to go that direction.
Thank you. Suzanne, would you have anything to say on this?
Very easy answer, and I think I've mentioned it already, that the newly developed Russian systems, which were not only announced but also partly introduced by now, are of great concern to us. And of course, we would favor that these weapon systems are covered by a future arms control arrangement.
Thank you. So earlier I had mentioned the speech that Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov gave at the Carnegie Nuclear Conference in a session moderated by Rose. We covered several of the points that he had mentioned. He also reiterated President Putin's offer not to deploy INF systems in Europe if the US and NATO also do not do so, and also suggested verification. Rose then asked him, what about the Asia Pacific sector? And he sort of said that that also could be covered under the moratorium, if I'm quoting Rose correctly. So I was wondering whether, starting with Rose, you would have any comments on this moratorium of INF systems, and particularly since your last posting was as Deputy Secretary General of NATO, this would have been an important issue on your table at the time.
Definitely. And the first offer that the Russians made was, in my view, and I will sound harsh here, but I think it was simply a propaganda stunt, because what they were proposing at the time, and this is back in September of 2019, before I left NATO to return to the United States, they were proposing that all INF range systems be part of the moratorium. Well, they, of course, were not acknowledging that the 9M729 missile of concern to NATO, it's called SSC-8 in NATO parlance, they were not saying that this was subject to the moratorium. So it was all about constraining a new US ground-launched intermediate range system missile that would be conventional in nature. So I was very blunt with the Russians at the time and said, this is a one-sided proposal. You're all about preventing a new US GLICM in Europe. You're saying nothing about the missile that concerns us, the 9M729. That is why I welcomed very much what I call the refreshed moratorium proposal that Vladimir Putin made in October of 2020, when he said that they will include the 9M729 in their moratorium offer, but they will not acknowledge, and they say it's a goodwill gesture. That's how Sergei Ryabkov put it yesterday. It's a goodwill gesture. We are not acknowledging that this is a violation. We are not saying that, and in fact, he said point blank yesterday, it's never been tested to intermediate range. That is a point upon which the NATO allies, all of the NATO allies, disagree very much. They believe this missile was tested and several times to intermediate range. So to make a long story short, and the other point about the refreshed moratorium proposal is that the verification and monitoring regime would be extended to all of Europe, meaning all of European Russia. When the proposal first came out, again, way back in September of 2019, it did not include any monitoring or verification regime. So I think that the current proposal on the table from the Russians is worth taking a good hard look at. And I hope the NATO allies will do so. I've been urging it in my own capital because I think it could be part of a phased approach to renewing constraints on intermediate range nuclear forces. And that's exactly what Sergei Ryabkov was talking about yesterday. he said, I see, he was again speaking a bit informally. It wasn't articulating, as he said, a finished Russian government proposal, but he said, I see a three-phase approach in which we would start with Kaliningrad, making it clear through inspection measures in Kaliningrad that there are no intermediate range systems, no 9M729 deployed there. Then we would expand in the next phase to all of European Russia, as well as all of European territory. And then he said the third phase would be Asia. And it is also true that the Putin remarks from October of 2020 opened the door for talks on intermediate range systems in Asia, which would seem to draw in the Chinese, although the Russians are, again, very explicit that they will not drag the Chinese to the negotiating table. It has to be the Chinese who decide that it is in their interest to come to the negotiating table. I actually agree with that position, because you don't get anybody to negotiate by dragging them to the table. They have to be ready and see it in their interest to negotiate. So in any event, I thought Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov's remarks on this yesterday were very interesting, and frankly, I am personally, I stress personally, in agreement with the notion of that kind of phased approach to putting in place new constraints on intermediate range missiles.
Thank you. Rosa, as a follow-up, I was wondering whether you might be in a position to say on what basis the 9M729 was observed to be tested beyond INF range. I know the Obama administration didn't give us very much details. It was the Trump administration that identified the missile by its name that we are using. But in the open literature, we haven't seen what is the technical basis. So I'm not questioning it. I'm just seeking more information or clarification if you were in a position to say something.
I'm not.
Okay, thanks. Alexei?
I agree with all points that Rose made, but I will also add two comments to that. One is that moratorium would apply not only to nuclear medium and shorter range missiles, but to conventional as well. And in fact, the INF Treaty did not limit nuclear medium and short range missiles. It limited all medium and short range missiles, medium, nuclear and conventional. And I think that moratorium should be based on the same principle. The second point is that yes, Russia does not recognize that 9M729 was a violation. It proposes for non-deployment of those missiles in the European part of Russia as a gesture of goodwill. But we asked from the United States the right to inspect the ballistic missile defense silos in Romania and Poland. The United States also does not recognize or does not agree that those ballistic missile defense launchers may be used for offensive missiles. But the United States should agree on that also as a gesture of goodwill. So it will be goodwill gesture in exchange for goodwill gesture, but with stringent verification procedure. And I think it's very good.
May I just add, yes, as a two-finger to Alexei's very good comment, that in fact, Sergei Ryabkov did mention that yesterday, that the Russian side would like access to the Aegis Ashore sites in Poland and Romania in order to ensure that there are no offensive intermediate range missiles there. So exactly as you say, Alexei.
So Suzanne, this is a subject of course, immediate interest to Germany. So I was wondering what your views might be.
This is of great interest to Germany because once again, this moratorium idea has, of course, effects on our security. But I have to say, we remain very, very critical to the proposal and fully concur with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg's comments, who has repeatedly underlined that this Russian proposal on a moratorium lacks credibility, first and foremost because Russia has already deployed the weapon system. So for us, this moratorium idea is very difficult because the systems are highly movable, they are difficult to detect. And of course, a moratorium would come with huge and serious challenges in the field of verification. And if we would like to stick to our principle of the indivisibility of European security, this moratorium and the difficulties in verification would put this into question. One word on NATO's self-restraint, which is already exercised. Once again, Stoltenberg, who has very clearly said that NATO will not mirror the Russian behavior. So I think a very clear position on the moratorium.
Alexei, would you like to comment on that, or shall we move on?
Well, of course, Suzanne is right. In contrast to INF Treaty, which banned those missiles globally, if we ban their deployment in Europe, but they are deployed elsewhere, the prohibition would not be so stringent as before. And those systems could be redeployed quickly from other regions of the world back to Europe. And that would require quite extensive verification regimes. But that is easily resolved if the United States abandons their plan to deploy medium-range missiles in Asia. Then we could have a global moratorium on deployment of the missiles that are of concern to the West, 9 and 7 to 9, and to the American missiles which might be deployed in Asia to counter China. As for Chinese medium-range missiles, the United States, I think, could rely as before on their huge superiority in sea-launched long-range cruise missiles, in particular Tomahawk systems, which are not in any way inferior to land-based missiles, maybe even superior to land-based missiles.
Thanks. Rose?
I don't really want to comment any further. I know, this is a policy that's under review again in the new administration in Washington. It's obvious, and I know very well what the NATO position is, and I can't argue with it. But I do think, personally speaking, I think it's an offer worth looking at, and we'll see. We'll see what the U.S. review produces, and I know there will be consultations and discussions with the NATO allies about it.
So, Rose, in your book, you cited James Timby, whom I know as well. And so James Timby, in an article in Daedalus last year, he recommended that the nuclear powers, 5 of them, refrain from policies linking nuclear responses to non-nuclear, that is cyber, counterspace, and conventional attacks. And he also called for use of caution in drawing upon artificial intelligence to support decision-making. So I was wondering what your views might be on those 2 recommendations.
Well, I agree with Jim in that case. I think it's worth probably a whole seminar session. Tarek, maybe Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation would like to organize another discussion on the implications of emerging and disruptive technologies for nuclear deterrence and really the operational aspects that, as Susanna put it a little while ago, lead us all to be very concerned that there could be some escalatory pressures that emerge from the use of emerging and disruptive technologies, whether in command and control or in warning systems, et cetera. And then we aren't even talking about the possibility of cyber attacks and other types of disruptive action that might damage nuclear command and control. And none of us can welcome that, no matter where we are, Moscow, Washington, Beijing, wherever. So I really do think that this is a topic that needs a lot more attention and needs a lot more work. And as I said, we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it.
Yeah. Okay. And staying with you, Rose, in the same issue, Linton Brooks, whom you also mentioned, who also is a former negotiator, he had this article which he titled "The End of Arms Control," but this was way before he thought that New START could be extended. And he pointed out 4 important issues that I think the 3 of you have brought up in one way or another. One is national ballistic missile defense, one is non-strategic nuclear weapons, space strike forces, and conventional strategic forces as being the issues that, in his view, should or could be discussed in the follow-on to New START.
Well, I agree with that, and those are exactly the issues I think that Alexei brought to the table, as well as being very important to the Russian side. So we'll have to find a way to bring the 2 sides together, as I put it, on those important issues.
So to wind up, do you have any final comments, and then I will move on to the other 2.
Well, I wanted to just say thank you again to Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation and to you and to Madam Crawford as well. It's really great to have this opportunity to be here, and I've really enjoyed the conversation a lot. So I'm always happy to be on the same stage, even virtually, with Alexei Arbatov and Susanna Baumann.
Thank you. Alexei, the same to you, the comments that I quoted from Jim Timby and Linton Brooks, and any final wrap-up comments you might have.
With respect to Jim Timby's proposal, I'm fully in agreement with his point about not linking nuclear strike to cyber operations, because cyber operations are inherently non-attributable. Starting a nuclear war on a highly likely premises would be a catastrophe for the whole world. Besides, there is no logic in it. Command and control systems are needed for retaliatory strike, for deterrence. If they are used in response to cyber attack, you start nuclear war yourself on the ground of suspicions of cyber attack against command and control system. With respect to conventional nuclear deterrence of conventional attacks, I already mentioned, I would be in favor of abandoning nuclear first use and abandoning any idea of first use of nuclear weapons, provided that strategic conventional attacks against nuclear forces are not possible, because conventional strategic systems are limited by arms control treaties. Otherwise, how can you deter conventional counter-force attack against your nuclear forces, but with the threat of nuclear retaliation? There is a logical strategic link between the 2. And finally, I agree with the list of Linton Brooks. Also, I think that we should present at the beginning the lists of our proposed subjects, but we should not stick to them, because if we insist on placing everything in one basket, we will not be able to start negotiations, and we will not be able to end negotiations by a treaty. I think that the first part of consultations and real negotiations would be busy with doing away of other issues that might complicate the negotiations so much that they are deadlocked. Some of those may be removed to separate groups, like cyber, for instance. Others may be removed to separate groups, like space, for instance. With ballistic missile defense, I would have a special group on ballistic missile defense within offensive arms negotiations, like it was done when START 1 was negotiated. But certainly, we should not make the best the enemy of the good, and we should make a point of having the new treaty, hopefully, in 1924. Because,
2024.
Yeah, 1924. Because who knows what the presidential elections in the United States will bring. And I'm also grateful to Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and I'm very happy to discuss with Rose and with you and with Suzanne those interesting, fascinating issues.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Yeah, new technologies and the effects on nuclear weapon systems. I think I've made this point is one of the priorities what we are pursuing as a German government right now. I just would like to mention that we have initiated a couple of issues, like for example, the Missile Dialogue Initiative, which looks exactly into these interlinkages and where we bring together diplomats and the expert community to better understand what, for example, a cyber development in the cyber sphere or in artificial intelligence can mean for the use of missiles. So I think very important issue which we will continue to engage in. The same is true, I think, for space issues where some countries, the BRICS, Germany and others have come up with new initiatives. I think that's something which has to be discussed. I think cyber, artificial intelligence, all this goes beyond bilateral negotiations between the US and Russia. That's more to be discussed on a global scale. And I think, and this has not been mentioned also with the inclusion of China, where we have seen a lot of development and rapid development in these areas over the last couple of years. Also from my part, once again, thank you to Rose, to Alexei, to you, Tariq, and especially Ms. Crawford, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, who has taken the initiative for today's panel. Thank you.
So thank you. So let me thank from my side, both Rose, Alexei, and Suzanne, and may I now pass it back to Claudia to wrap up the proceedings.
The thanks is really on our side. We are very happy to do those kind of events together with Atomic Reporter to get so much insights. So thank you so much, Rose, Alexei, Susanna, and also you, Tariq, for this very, very interesting insight to the meaningful characteristic of New START. You have provided us with an excellent overview of a highly complex picture with key background information and a lot of food for thought, which should be further elaborated. I also would like to thank our audience from around the world for joining us and also for your stimulating questions and comments. We have learned how important it is to provide a platform for dialogue. We have got reminded how challenging negotiations can be, not impossible. We have witnessed that arms control treaties are especially needed. Our next online event will take place in September in cooperation with Atomic Reporters, and it will elaborate on cyber, drones, and new technology. So just what you recommended to us that we should do. So you already touched upon this important topic in the last round of discussion. Till then, we will have a summer break. Unfortunately, I don't have all the publications which were mentioned, just the one from Rose Göttemöller, and I really like to recommend it as a summer reading. I wish you a pleasant summer break. Thank you again. Keep safe and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.